All right, so this is economics for philosophers, all right? I've looked into this a lot, thought about this a lot, and I've managed to track down some concepts that are, compatible with classical economics way of looking at it, and kind of not limited to that. This is a philosophical thing, so like a discussion of how do you understand economics, what at a philosophical policy level, which is involved with having a philosophical approach to policy. How do you think about this stuff on its most fundamental level, which means most simplified, right? So not the most detailed. You could say it lacks nuance. It's getting at where's the big fulcrum points and stuff like this. And so you'll see, I didn't invent this idea of land, labor, and capital. I just typed that into Google Images, and you get a lot of things like this. This little image here is a good example of, so there's the labor working, he's on the land, and then capital is wealth. Traditionally, when I was younger trying to define this stuff, I thought capital meant money, and capitalism means the people with money get to run things. Capitalarchy. But no, the idea of capital, money is a form you can take capital in, but actually it's stuff that if you just use it for fun would be wealth. Like if you have your car and you just drive it around for fun, then that's wealth. If you need it to work, like you drive Uber or to get to work even, then that could be considered capital. Or here's an example. This guy's working. There's a coffee tree, I guess, and here's a coffee grinder or Mac nuts. And the equipment you use is, if you just had it for fun, it'd be wealth, but you use it for production, then it's capital. So, for example, way back in the day, there's a guy who had the idea. He got a bunch of boats, he got a bunch of baskets, and he got some people to take those boats and baskets out to the Farallon Islands, and it's just distracting, this new set of the green screen room. But anyway, they went out there and picked the eggs. They got paid in eggs. The baskets and the boats were capital. Right? Now, clearly you can work at a place that you have a capital investment in, say your own factory, and you could own the land as well. And that's something this kind of framework brings up. Okay, there's a way to discuss that, because there's different kinds of views. Now, with these definitions, they're very accepted. I don't have to define what labor and land is, right? And it starts from having wealth that you apply, because with your labor on the land, you can create some wealth, which then you can use. It's like, hey, I made 2 spears. Here's a spear for you. I want some of the meat that you use to go get it, when they use it to go get. So these are terms that you can then discuss economics in from a philosophical point of view. Now, what would capitalism mean in a framework like this? And again, I remind you that this is like from John Smith to everybody on both sides, in the modern, the Friedmans and the Keynesians, they think in terms of this. There's a philosophical sort of divide that shows up when people think of land itself as capital or wealth, right? So separating, it's always separated, but then it's also grouped, because that's how we have done it with deeds. But, separating it out strongly, of course, is in the favor of people that think that it's more a resource like the air or clean water. It's a shared resource. You're not making any more of it. So it's not a regular kind of wealth. And I believe you have to separate that out. And that raises the question, really, though, it doesn't change these definitions, because that argument is, should there be landlords? Like, you can't have owners of labor. That's slavery. But can you have owner of the land? Well, you can have owner of capital, so sure, you could have owner of the land. Some people maybe think you should have ownership of labor. These terms don't prejudice that, except for by putting something on the table of, well, how will we deal with land? So right now you can't own land with the deed. And so, there's a landlord, and what is that? A landist. The capitalist is the guy that focuses on. Again, you can be in all of these positions on having the equipment and the space, and then labor works. So, one interpretation of capitalism and the negative idea of it, of what people will cast a negative idea, is capitalism. It's as if capitalism's the belief that labor should just be paid based on costs, and capital should get all the benefit of it if there's 1,000% profits. And what does the landlord think? How much does he think he should get from your success? Because he can just arbitrarily or she raise the rent price, right? So the analysis I prefer of historical economics is that what has happened is even before the modern system, but what has happened is that all of the extra productivity of automation and stuff ultimately goes to the landlords. They have the longest term interest in this finite resource, where if people are more productive, they can just draw more rents. Capital, not so much, except for when the capitalist becomes the landlord. The capitalist in themselves, the guy that leases you a printing machine, and just says, give me $100 a month, and you keep the rest of however much you make using this printing machine. That kind of capitalist isn't getting more and more percent. They're getting like people that loan money. They're getting their 10% or 15%, whatever the going range. It's narrow. It doesn't go up and up and up to 200%, and in a way it couldn't. But land does. Land's prices double and triple, and that's where the money's being taken out of the society, which is why, as a political position, I think that that's why the government's justified in controlling land more and having property taxes. And it's not just like, I don't know, a pen or I was going to pick up my mouse is something I own and it's totally tradable. And, it's not something that should be possible to monopolize or semi-monopolize or whatever. So really, that just gets into my belief about, how the system should work, what other people mean by capitalism. What does it mean for me to capitalism is, capital is wealth that you reinvest. So to me, a capitalist, and by the definitions I've now chosen, I understand other people don't have this definition yet, but so I don't use this word with this definition without telling people, but I have this definition now, and when people say the word to me, I hear my own definition as well, though I know probably they don't mean the same thing, though possibly. The idea is that since capital is wealth that you use for your business, when you go buy a yacht, a personal luxury yacht with your money that you make off of your $1 million business, that is not capitalist, right? That's hedonistic, which is fine. What's capitalist is when you reinvest it in your business, when you raise the price you'll pay labor, when you build another factory. That's capitalist. Whether it's a good decision or not, the idea that you're making more baskets and boats to get more eggs or whatever, or for that matter, you're investing in raising birds so there can be more birds and more eggs, you're protecting the resource instead of just consuming it. Those things are actually what should be called capitalistic, because you're basically trying to get an interest of improvement. So it's not so capitalistic to dig all the resources out of a piece of land, right? That's just consumptive. What's capitalistic is what you build with those resources. So with because all in this model, land is not just like the space, it's all the resources in the land. It's all the trees you could grow on it, it's all the corn you could grow on it, it's all the rocks you could pull out of it, right? And that so it's the material resources. Ultimately, that's where all the wealth comes from, right? And in a way, it's growing out of land, even if it's iPods and people are there. Obviously, it's not literally growing out of land, but it has to be on some piece of land, and the resources are brought together, and ultimately, all of these minerals and everything that we use chemically does actually come from plants and minerals in the dirt located in some piece of land. And this is why we want to regulate the land differently. But it's also, to me, this view, it's pretty redemptive of being all negative on capitalism. That's not so much the problem. It's almost like the capitalist that actually is trying to, like, I don't know, facilitate, he's trying to get this equipment, get this job done. He deserves a payment for borrowing his property, and labor deserves it. And land is kind of, we all deserve the benefit of the fact that there's minerals in the ground that, and so that, to me, is, a shared resource. That's where the negative connotations come from. The rent is too damn high, right? The capitalist, other than being the landlord, is not a problem. And even landlords is not a problem as individual type of person. I've had good landlords, and even in this sense, your house that's on top of the land, that's capital, right? You can move that or tear it down or whatever. So the land is literally what's underneath that capital thing. So you'd still have landlords or like renters, like in a hotel. I don't want to buy a house. I'm just going to be here a couple days. You could do the same thing for long-term rentals. And there's capitalism involved there because the house is capital. But the basic idea of land ownership, I think, is a fundamental way of re-understanding stuff, and it also shows that labor and capital working together to make stuff. It's silly for them to have some, there were other ideas before we got this capitalism versus the Marx thing, and like, we hate each other forever. So I think philosophically we could solve that fight through our understanding of what land is as a resource. And Henry George brings in this, we got to cut out the landlord. And as a term landlord, I'd say that, but not necessarily. I mean, land custodians is still something you would have. And you'd have all the rights of ownership that you have now, given, zoning and whatever ecological laws that people might have about how you can use your land. Just the same lack of and establishment of rules on how you use your land. So you basically would be controlling that land as an owner. And the issue is, sort of this libertarian idea that you have to be using it. And so basically, why not rent the basic land from the government, and if you build capital on it, fine. If you want to leave that land and don't rent anymore, you're able to take all that capital. So anyway, these are the basic elements. You can express any known form of economic idea with reference to how are each of these resources managed. Capital, labor, and land, and obviously it's all going to be by people. And so what are the roles? What do you separate? Which do you tax? Because everything falls in here somewhere. It's these three things produce products, which are wealth, and where does society as a whole, where should the military, somebody wants to pay for the military, where are we really supposed to get that? And right now it's all of the above. I mean, people are really aware of their income taxes, but that's just the least of it. Businesses know there's all kinds of taxes and tariffs and ways to do it. What would be the philosophical guiding principle in making decisions about that? And people have a lot of answers to that question, and they could be discussed in terms of these terms. And by doing this search, I was just showing that even though people have all kinds of weird versions, look, here's where you have land, labor, capital, and organization, and they all arrow in on product. It's all over the map how you want to visualize this. Not a lot of great, but just to show you those terms it's not just that those are our general way, and this is an overview of how to do it, how you can have a framework to discuss that, because this is the thing that isn't connecting with people. Well, some people, but that, I'm not really usually putting a thesis of a final opinion. I'm usually saying, here's the spectrum, here's all the things, here's terms, you can talk about the pros and the cons, because I'm in a situation of going, hey, well, this makes some sense, but what about this thing? And why is the space in between these two ideas empty, or are they? Does it make sense all along? In other words, there's a whole space of possible ideas, and people think about this as the reasoning process just to find the one you like. Like, there's 5 of these, I don't know, and it's like, I got to decide which one. Well, most of the time I find you don't have to decide. You can have all 5 of those ideas and say, well, a little bit of that and a little more of this and, really strongly this, but I'm not sure, and here's the caveat. And why can you do that? Because when a real situation comes along in life and you have to make the decision, you can look at all of that. You can decide when 1 in 10 times that person really was being honest in that situation you're doubtful about. So you give it 1/10 of the way to, but there was this other thing happened when I saw this other part of the situation. You can weigh the pros and cons. And the real situation is like something that can be triangulated by the spectrum of positions. So when I'm trying to understand the economy, I basically am trying to make terms that I can plot all the other, okay, what does Friedman think in terms of what I said? Well, that capital should get all the benefit and own both the land and the labor. You can translate all different kinds of philosophical systems into these common terms, and then you can really see how they compare. Because by default, when they're schools of philosophy, they all have their own terms, and they want to be understood on their own terms. You have to break them down into common terms. And frankly, you should do that fairly. When one of these schools has created a new concept, you have to allow that it comes in. So for example, if some school of economics says, no, land is exactly like, and is property, your body's property, there's no distinction between these 3 things, that's fine. They're saying those 3 things, which it is possible to make a distinction between, all are, the same, like mass and energy. But it doesn't mean that you can't make the distinction. It just means they're saying ultimately the distinction doesn't well, they're saying they have a unifying theory for this distinction that explains how the distinction is, what makes the distinction apparent. And so they ought to allow those terms still in for the purposes of, and this is just of discussion, and this is just the skeptical technique. This is why skepticism became used among natural philosophers. It's a way of people that are as boneheaded as Gary and Hythloday and Bill Gates and dissident scientists all over. They wanted to talk about their different systems, and they're just as strong-headed in their own system as those guys are. And skepticism is a way of being able to discuss things even when you have that big of a difference. Because what you do is you break things down into common terms that are in themselves neutral, that you can put together in sentences to express all of your own different ideas. And then in natural science, they said, and let's test them. That's harder to do in, outside of the laboratory. But it was built into skepticism, that you have these ideas and you would test them in your own life, right? Like a philosophy of how should you treat others? You should push them around, or you should be nice to them. You could test that. And so with big policies, we can test them. We enact them and see how they work and then adjust. And the fact is, we have a lot of policies that we know how they work, that people are holding back because they are greedy, and it's not in their own best greedy interest to let those things go forward. But we know lots of solutions, and I'm not just talking about 4th generation nuclear, but a lot of other things as well. All right, that's good enough for now.